The water was dark and mirror calm, as 10 German destroyers sailed into Ofotfjord on April 10, 1940, at 4:15 in the morning, with mountains on either side rising 3,000 feet straight up to snow-covered peaks that disappeared into low clouds hanging over this remote Norwegian fjord that would become the grave for the entire flotilla within days. Kaptein zur See Friedrich Bonte stood on the bridge of Z-21 Wilhelm Heidkamp as flotilla commander, watching 9 more destroyers following behind him in single file, including Z9 Wolfgang Zenker and Z11 Bernd von Arnim, and Z12 Erich Gieser, and Z13 Erich Kollner, and Z17 Dieter von Roeder, and Z18 Hans Ludemann, and Z19 Hermann Kühne, and Z2 Georg Thiele, and Z22 Anton Schmidt, representing the most modern destroyers in the Kriegsmarine. Each of these vessels displaced 2,400 tons and was armed with 5 5.9-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes, and was capable of 38 knots maximum speed, making them formidable warships by any standard. But on this particular morning they were carrying unusual cargo, because each destroyer had been packed with 210 mountain troops, filling every available space, including sleeping on deck and in passageways and even in engine rooms, with rifles stacked against bulkheads and ammunition crates lashed to superstructure in ways that compromised the ship's fighting capabilities, but maximized troop transport capacity for the invasion mission. Their mission was straightforward in concept, though complex in execution, requiring them to capture Narvik and secure the port and hold it until reinforcements could arrive from other elements of the invasion force, and the invasion itself went perfectly according to plan, with Norwegian coastal defense ships being caught completely by surprise. The 2 ancient ironclads Eidsvold and Norge, dating from 1899, represented the only Norwegian naval opposition in the area, with Eidsvold opening fire first and managing 1 salvo before Wilhelm Heidkamp put 4 torpedoes into her at point-blank range, causing her to explode and capsize and sink in 90 seconds, while taking 175 men with her. Norge attempted to escape and made it approximately 300 yards before torpedoes from Z12, Erich Gieser, ripped her apart and sent her to the bottom with 90 men. And by 5:30 a.m., Narvik was firmly in German hands as troops disembarked and secured the town, while meeting only minimal resistance from the Norwegian garrison of fewer than 400 men who surrendered without significant fighting. Bonte radioed Berlin with a message reporting that Narvik had been secured and the mission accomplished, and requesting further orders, feeling satisfaction at the successful completion of his assigned task. But then he checked his fuel gauges and realized the catastrophic problem that would doom his entire flotilla. His destroyers were nearly empty after having burned through 70% of their fuel during the voyage from Germany to Norway, and each destroyer required approximately 400 tons of fuel oil to refuel for the return journey, creating a total requirement of 4,000 tons that should have been provided by the tanker Jan Wellem according to the operation plan. The plan had been elegantly simple, with Jan Wellem scheduled to arrive in Narvik on April 8, 2 days before the invasion, where she would pre-position her cargo of fuel oil so the destroyers could refuel immediately after landing their troops, and then sail back to Germany without delay. But Jan Wellem had never arrived at Narvik because she had been intercepted by the Norwegian Navy on April 7th and seized and taken to Bergen, where her entire cargo of 4,500 tons of fuel oil now sat uselessly in a Norwegian port that was completely unreachable by the German destroyers trapped in Narvik. Bonte's destroyers were stuck with 10 of Germany's most modern warships, trapped in a Norwegian fjord, with barely enough fuel to maneuver locally and certainly insufficient fuel to fight their way back to Germany through waters that were likely to be contested by British naval forces. He radioed Berlin again with a message reporting that his flotilla required immediate fuel resupply and could not depart without refueling, and the response that came 6 hours later must have filled him with dread, because it stated simply that no tankers were available, and he should await further instructions, creating a situation where 10 destroyers had become sitting ducks trapped in a confined waterway with limited fuel and no immediate prospect of relief. Meanwhile, at Scapa Flow in Scotland on April the 9th at 2:00 p.m., Admiral William Whitworth received orders to take the battlecruiser HMS Renown and 4 destroyers and proceed to Norwegian waters to investigate reports of German naval activity that was fragmentary and confusing, with multiple sightings of German warships in different locations. Some reports indicated German forces were heading north, while others suggested westward movements, creating uncertainty about German intentions and forced dispositions. But one thing was absolutely clear, which was that Germany had launched a major naval operation requiring immediate Royal Navy response. Whitworth's force departed Scapa Flow at 4:00 p.m., with Renown displacing 32,000 tons and mounting 6 15-inch guns, leading 4 destroyers named HMS Hardy, HMS Hunter, HMS Havoc, and HMS Hotspur as they sailed northeast into deteriorating weather conditions, with wind increasing and seas building and visibility dropping steadily. By midnight, they were 300 miles from the Norwegian coast, operating in terrible weather with force 9 gale conditions and 40-foot seas that were battering the destroyers mercilessly. And then, at 3:37 a.m. on April 9th, Renown's radar picked up contacts showing 2 large ships at range of 12 miles on course southeast. Whitworth ordered action stations, and the contacts closed to 8 miles and then 6 miles before the fog lifted momentarily, revealing Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, Germany's 2 battlecruisers, each mounting 9 11-inch guns and serving as covering forces for the invasion fleet. The engagement lasted 18 minutes, with Renown firing 36 15-inch shells and hitting Gneisenau 3 times, damaging her fire control system and disabling 1 turret, while the German battlecruisers returned fire with 42 11-inch shells, achieving 2 hits on Renown that caused minor damage without casualties. Then weather closed in again, with visibility dropping to 0, and the German ships disappeared and broke off the engagement heading northeast, and Whitworth pursued for 2 hours, but tracking them in those conditions proved impossible, and they escaped. At dawn, Whitworth received new intelligence indicating that German destroyers had been sighted entering Narvik, with multiple units possibly constituting a landing force, leading him to make a critical decision to forget about pursuing the battlecruisers and instead head for Narvik, where he could deal with German destroyers if they were present. HMS Renown turned north with her 4 destroyers following toward destination Ofotfjord, where a series of engagements would unfold that would destroy Germany's destroyer force and fundamentally alter the naval balance in Norwegian waters. Captain Bernard Warburton Lee commanded the destroyer flotilla from his flagship HMS Hardy, a 40-year-old officer who was professional and cautious and not given to reckless action under normal circumstances, and he received Whitworth's orders at 9:00 a.m. on April 9th, instructing him to proceed to Narvik and assess German forces and report findings, while specifically ordering him not to engage unless he had clear superiority. Warburton Lee acknowledged these orders, but had serious concerns because intelligence indicated German destroyers were in Narvik, but didn't specify how many, leaving open the possibility that he might encounter 2 destroyers or 5 or even 10 without knowing in advance. He also needed to understand the German fuel situation and whether they were preparing to leave or were trapped in the fjord. So he stopped at Trandøy, a small fishing village 30 miles from Narvik, and sent a landing party ashore to find the local pilot who could provide current information. The pilot told them everything they needed to know, including that 10 German destroyers had landed troops 2 days earlier and were still in Narvik harbor, refueling from a tanker, creating a situation where Warburton Lee faced 10 German destroyers, with only his 4 British destroyers in odds that were decidedly unfavorable. But he also understood something important, which was that if those destroyers were refueling, then they were vulnerable because they would be low on fuel and tied to docks and unable to maneuver effectively, making this potentially the best opportunity to attack them before they could complete refueling and escape back to Germany, where they would be available for operations against British convoys. He radioed Whitworth requesting permission to attack at dawn with support from Renown. But the response came back immediately stating that Renown was too large to enter the fjord due to insufficient depth, and that Warburton Lee had discretion to engage if the situation permitted. Discretion was the word that every naval officer both loved and feared, because it meant that he had to decide and take responsibility for whatever happened, with success making him a hero, while failure would result in relief from command and possibly court-martial. Warburton Lee studied the charts carefully, noted that Ofotfjord was 40 miles long and narrow and steep-sided, meaning that once his destroyers entered, there would be only one way out, which was back the way they came, creating a trap where if he got his 4 destroyers caught inside, they would all be destroyed without possibility of escape or reinforcement. But if he didn't attack, then those 10 German destroyers would complete refueling and sail back to Germany and be available for future operations against British shipping and naval forces, potentially affecting the entire course of the Norwegian campaign and the broader war in the North Atlantic. He made his decision to attack at dawn at 04:30 hours using maximum speed and maximum surprise to hit the German destroyers while they were still tied to docks, and then withdraw immediately, representing a calculated risk of the type that either wins wars or ends careers depending on how events unfold. At 4:00 a.m. on April 10th, 4 British destroyers entered Ofotfjord, with HMS Hardy leading, followed by HMS Hunter and Havoc and Hotspur, at spacing of 400 yards and speed of 25 knots. And the weather was perfect with calm water and no wind and visibility of 3 miles, while soft snow fell in large flakes drifting down through the darkness. Warburton Lee stood on Hardy's bridge, understanding they were committed now and inside the fjord with mountains rising on either side, like black walls against a grey sky, and there was no turning back from this point forward, regardless of what they encountered. At 4:20 a.m., they rounded the final bend, and there was Narvik 2 miles ahead, with harbour lights visible and ships at anchor. And Warburton Lee raised his binoculars and counted 5 destroyers tied to the docks, appearing dark with no lookouts visible, though he didn't know yet that he was seeing only half the German force, because the other 5 destroyers were anchored in side fjords out of sight, where they were refueling from merchant ships. At 4:30 a.m., Hardy opened fire from 4,000 yards with all guns blazing, and the surprise was complete because German crews were sleeping or eating breakfast or performing routine maintenance without any expectation of attack. Wilhelm Heidkamp took the first hits, with 3 shells penetrating her hull and exploding inside, and 1 shell hit the bridge, killing Capitan Bonte instantly, along with most of his command staff, followed by a torpedo that struck amidships and broke her back, causing her to sink in 5 minutes while taking 81 men with her, including the flotilla commander, whose death would complicate German command and control for the remainder of the engagement. The other 4 British destroyers spread out and engaged multiple targets simultaneously, creating chaos in Narvik harbor as German destroyers attempted to get underway and return fire, while British torpedoes and shells struck repeatedly. Z-22 Anton Schmidt took 2 torpedo hits and sank in 8 minutes. Z-19 Hermann Kuhne was hit repeatedly by gunfire and disabled, though she didn't sink immediately, and the harbor became filled with smoke and explosions and burning ships as the British destroyers pressed their attack with aggressive determination. But then at 4:47 a.m. disaster struck for the British, when German destroyers that had been refueling inside fjords emerged from their anchorages and caught the British force from behind, creating a deadly crossfire situation where Warburton Lee's destroyers were trapped between German forces in the harbor ahead and German reinforcements cutting off their retreat. HMS Hardy took multiple hits from Z-9 Wolfgang Zenker that disabled her steering and set her afire, and Warburton Lee ordered his crew to abandon ship before she ran aground and became a total loss, though Warburton Lee himself was killed during the engagement along with most of his bridge crew. HMS Hunter took shell hits that detonated her forward magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion that broke her in half and sent her to the bottom in 90 seconds with 107 men killed, while HMS Hotspur was severely damaged by gunfire and had to be towed to safety by HMS Havoc. The First Battle of Narvik ended with both sides claiming tactical victories, but neither achieving decisive strategic results, because while the British had sunk 2 German destroyers and damaged several others, they had lost 2 destroyers of their own and withdrawn without destroying the German force, leaving 8 German destroyers still operational in Narvik, though with continued fuel shortages. British losses totaled 2 destroyers sunk, including the flotilla commander, Captain Warburton Lee, who was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his courage in pressing home the attack despite facing superior numbers, along with 154 men killed, while German losses included 2 destroyers sunk and Kapitän Bonte killed and approximately 120 men dead. The situation in Narvik remained strategically important because those 8 surviving German destroyers represented a significant threat if they could be refueled and returned to Germany. But they also represented a tempting target if the Royal Navy could organize a force sufficient to destroy them completely. Admiral Whitworth understood the opportunity and began planning a second attack that would be overwhelming in force and decisive in outcome, recognizing that he needed to bring sufficient firepower to ensure complete destruction of the German flotilla, without risking another costly engagement like the first battle. The key to his plan was HMS Warspite, a battleship displacing 31,000 tons and mounting 8 15-inch guns protected by 13-inch armor belt, representing a level of firepower and protection that German destroyers simply couldn't match with their 5.9-inch guns that couldn't penetrate Warspite's heavy armor. The challenge was that the fjord was barely deep enough for Warspite because she drew 33 feet while the fjord averaged 40 feet depth, making navigation extremely tight and dangerous. But Whitworth determined it was possible if executed carefully. Whitworth's plan involved HMS Warspite, leading 9 destroyers including Bedouin and Punjabi and Eskimo and Kimberley and Forester and Foxhound and Hero and Icarus and Cossack straight up Ofotfjord, where they would systematically find and sink every German destroyer remaining in the area. And the departure was scheduled for April the 13th at 0400 hours, giving the force 3 days to prepare and the Germans 3 days to worry about what was coming. At 5:00 a.m. on April the 13th, HMS Warspite entered Ofotfjord, with her massive bulk filling the channel, while 9 destroyers followed in column behind her, creating a steel serpent winding through the mountains that represented overwhelming force against which the remaining German destroyers had no realistic hope of victory. The Germans knew the British were coming because they had 3 days to prepare by emplacing shore batteries and repositioning destroyers and selecting ambush points. But they also understood that they couldn't win against a battleship because their guns couldn't penetrate Warspite's armor, and their only chance lay in torpedoes if they could get close enough to launch them, which seemed unlikely given the British forces' numerical and qualitative superiority. At 5:45 a.m., the first German destroyer opened fire when Z-13 Erich Kölner engaged from a side fjord at range of 8,000 yards, and Warspite's 15-inch guns traversed and elevated and fired with the first salvo missing short by 50 yards but the second salvo scoring a direct hit on Erich Kölner's forward magazine. The destroyer exploded and literally disintegrated with one moment showing her present and the next moment showing only debris and smoke, demonstrating the devastating power of battleship guns against destroyer-sized targets that lacked armor protection. The other German destroyers scattered and attempted to use the fjord's complex geography to their advantage by hiding in side channels and behind rocks and islands, trying anything to avoid Warspite's main battery that could destroy them with single hits. But the British destroyers hunted them down methodically, working through each side fjord and channel systematically. HMS Cossack found Z2 Georg Thiele hiding in Herjungsfjord and engaged at 4,000 yards, with the German destroyer fighting back gamely and hitting Cossack twice, but being overwhelmed by concentrated British fire that achieved 18 hits in 4 minutes before Georg Thiele ran aground and exploded as her remaining ammunition detonated. HMS Eskimo engaged Z-12 Erich Gieser in a running battle down Rombaksfjord, with both ships at maximum speed and maneuvering violently. And Erich Gieser launched torpedoes with one hitting Eskimo's bow and blowing off the forward 40 feet. But Eskimo kept fighting and returned fire and pursued relentlessly until finally cornering Erich Gieser in shallow water and pounding her into scrap. HMS Forester and Foxhound trapped Z-9, Hermann Kühne, and Z-17 Hans Ludemann in Ballangen Bay, where it became a massacre because 2 British destroyers engaged 2 German destroyers with support from Warspite's guns, and the German destroyers were pulverized by overwhelming firepower until both beached themselves as burning wrecks. By noon, it was completely over with every German destroyer in Narvik having been sunk or scuttled or run aground, including Z-11 Bernd von Arnim, beached and burning in Narvik Harbour, Z-9 Wolfgang Zenker, scuttled in deep water, Z-18 Dieter von Ruder, sunk by Warspite's guns, and the last survivor Z-22 Anton Schmidt, trapped in Rombaksfjord out of ammunition and nearly out of fuel, with her captain ordering the crew to abandon ship before scuttling her in 60 feet of water. The Second Battle of Narvik was complete with German losses totaling 8 destroyers sunk or scuttled and approximately 400 men killed, representing the annihilation of the entire flotilla that had sailed into Ofotfjord just 3 days earlier with such confidence. British losses were remarkably light, with only 2 destroyers moderately damaged and 38 men killed, demonstrating the effectiveness of overwhelming force properly applied against trapped enemies who lacked options for escape or reinforcement. In Berlin on April 14th at 8:00 a.m., Grand Admiral Erich Raeder read the casualty reports with growing dismay as he realized that 10 destroyers were gone and Germany's entire modern destroyer force had been reduced by 36% in just 4 days. And the strategic implications were catastrophic because those destroyers had been supposed to escort U-boats and protect convoys and screen capital ships. but now they rested at the bottom of a Norwegian fjord, where they would never sail again. Building replacements would require years because Germany's shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity, and every destroyer lost was effectively irreplaceable, given the competing demands for construction resources and the time required to build such complex vessels. Raeder questioned whether capturing Narvik had been worth 36% of the destroyer fleet, acknowledging that yes, it secured the iron ore route from Sweden, and yes, it denied the port to the British. But the price seemed catastrophically high for a town of 4,000 people. He wrote in his diary that the Narvik operation succeeded in its immediate objectives, but at unacceptable cost, noting that Germany couldn't afford to trade destroyers for territory because the Royal Navy possessed hundreds of destroyers, while Germany had fewer than 20, making this kind of attrition a pathway to certain defeat. Hitler saw the situation differently and focused on the operational success represented by Norway being occupied, and Britain being humiliated, and strategic resources being secured, viewing the destroyer losses as regrettable but acceptable prices for achieving broader strategic objectives. Raeder knew better from his naval experience and strategic understanding, but said nothing because contradicting Hitler on matters of strategic judgment had become increasingly dangerous, as the Führer consolidated power and eliminated dissenting voices from his inner circle. The trap at Narvik wasn't planned by British naval strategists, but rather was created by German overconfidence and logistical failure, with the destroyers going into the fjord without adequate fuel reserves and without proper tanker support and without air cover and without realistic escape options if things went wrong. They had assumed that surprise would be sufficient and that speed would compensate for other deficiencies, and that once Narvik was captured, everything else would fall into place according to plan. But instead, they created their own prison consisting of a steel cage 40 miles long with mountains for walls and British warships blocking the only exit. When historians analyze the Norway campaign, they typically focus on the big picture, including the strategic success of the invasion and the occupation of Denmark and Norway, and the denial of bases to Britain. But naval historians focus particularly on Narvik because it revealed fundamental flaws in Kriegsmarine strategy, showing that Germany couldn't afford attritional warfare, where every ship lost was irreplaceable, and every engagement had to be decisive and overwhelming with no margin for error. At Narvik, the Germans made errors and paid the ultimate price, with 10 destroyers sailing into the fjord and 0 coming out, demonstrating that geography trapped them and the Royal Navy destroyed them, and Germany's surface fleet never recovered from these losses. In Ofotfjord, on April 15th at dawn, the water was calm and the snow had stopped and the mountains were pristine and beautiful and peaceful, creating a scene of natural beauty that contrasted starkly with the violence that had occurred just days before. Beneath the tranquil surface, 10 destroyers lay scattered across 12 miles of fjord bottom, including Wilhelm Heidkamp in Narvik harbour, and Erich Kolner off Djupvik, and Georg Thiele in Herjangsfjord, and Erich Giese in Rombaksfjord, with hundreds of men still inside those wrecks sealed in compartments and trapped in engine rooms and sitting at their posts where they had died. Some would remain there forever because the water was too deep and the wrecks too dangerous, and recovery was impossible given the technical limitations of 1940s diving equipment. And in 70 years, when modern divers finally explored those wrecks, they would find artifacts and personal effects and photographs and letters home that were never sent, along with evidence of the last moments, including empty shell casings and battle damage and scorch marks where fires had burned. They would also find something surprising in several wrecks, including fuel tanks, that were nearly full on destroyers that were supposedly trapped because they couldn't refuel, revealing that the official story about Jan Wellem's capture, leaving the destroyers stranded, was only partially true. Some destroyers had in fact refueled from merchant ships and shore facilities and possessed sufficient fuel to reach Germany, but they stayed in Narvik because their orders required them to hold the position, and because leaving would mean abandoning the mountain troops they had landed, and because retreating in the face of the enemy violated military honor and German naval tradition. So they fought despite being hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned and trapped in a fjord with no realistic escape. And they died there, not because they were trapped by geography alone, but because they were trapped by duty and honor and orders that valued holding positions over preserving ships and lives. The Type 1936 A destroyers that formed the backbone of the German flotilla at Narvik represented the pinnacle of German destroyer design in the late 1930s, incorporating lessons learned from earlier classes while pushing the boundaries of size and armament in ways that made them among the most powerful destroyers in any navy at the time of their construction. These ships displaced 2,400 tons at standard load and over 3,000 tons at full load, making them significantly larger than most contemporary destroyers from other navies and allowing them to carry heavier armament and longer-range fuel supplies than smaller vessels could manage. The main armament consisted of 5.9-inch guns mounted in single turrets distributed along the centerline, with these weapons being larger than the 4.7-inch or 5-inch guns typical of British and American destroyers, providing longer range and heavier shell weight that theoretically gave German destroyers advantages in surface engagements against equivalent-sized opponents. The 8 torpedo tubes in 2 quadruple mounts provided formidable striking power with torpedoes that could sink capital ships if they struck vulnerable areas, and the anti-aircraft armament included multiple smaller caliber weapons designed to defend against aircraft attacks that were becoming increasingly important in modern naval warfare. The propulsion system used high-pressure steam turbines, driving 2 shafts and capable of generating 70,000 shaft horsepower, providing the 38-knot maximum speed that made these destroyers among the fastest warships afloat and allowed them to catch slower targets or escape from more powerful opponents when tactical situations required withdrawal. The fuel capacity of approximately 700 tons provided operational range of over 4,000 nautical miles at economical cruising speed, though this range decreased dramatically at higher speeds where fuel consumption increased exponentially, and the Narvik operation had pushed these destroyers to their limits by requiring them to sail at high speed for extended periods without opportunities for refueling. The crew complement of 325 officers and men represented substantial investment in training and manning that Germany could ill afford to lose, because each destroyer required experienced personnel who understood their ship's complex systems and could operate effectively in combat conditions, and replacing crews lost at Narvik would require months of training new personnel who would lack the combat experience that their predecessors had accumulated. The loss of experienced petty officers and senior ratings proved particularly damaging because these men provided the institutional knowledge and practical expertise that kept ships functioning effectively during prolonged operations far from major bases. The tactical doctrine for German destroyer operations emphasized aggressive surface action combined with torpedo attacks against larger opponents, based on the theory that destroyers operating in groups could overwhelm capital ships through coordinated attacks that saturated defenses and achieved hits that individual destroyers couldn't accomplish alone. This doctrine worked reasonably well when German destroyers operated with numerical superiority and freedom of maneuver. But at Narvik, they found themselves fighting in confined waters, where their speed advantage was negated, and their numerical superiority evaporated when British reinforcements arrived with overwhelming firepower. The geography of Ofotfjord played a decisive role in determining the battle's outcome because the narrow, confined waters prevented German destroyers from using their speed and maneuverability to advantage, forcing them to fight almost stationary engagements where British gunnery could achieve higher hit rates than would have been possible in open ocean battles. The steep-sided mountains surrounding the fjord created acoustic effects that made sound ranging and range-finding more difficult, while the irregular coastline provided hiding places that German destroyers attempted to exploit, though ultimately these proved to be traps rather than sanctuaries, when British forces methodically searched every side channel. The weather during the battles ranged from calm and clear during the first engagement to intermittent snow and limited visibility during the second battle, with these conditions affecting both sides' ability to detect and engage targets, but generally favoring the British, who had more ships and could afford to search systematically, while German forces attempted to avoid detection and engagement. The temperature remained below freezing throughout, creating additional hardship for crews who had to work on exposed decks and in unheated gun positions while their ships maneuvered and fought, with frostbite and exposure becoming additional casualties beyond those caused by enemy fire. The German command structure broke down catastrophically after Captain Bonte's death in the first battle, because no clear succession plan had been established, and the surviving destroyer captains had to coordinate their actions without unified command or clear strategic direction from higher headquarters. Individual captains made tactical decisions based on their local situations and understanding of overall circumstances, but without coordinated planning. The German response to the second British attack became fragmented and ineffective, with each destroyer essentially fighting its own battle, rather than operating as cohesive force, multiplying their effectiveness through cooperation. The British planning for the second attack demonstrated the advantages of having time to prepare an overwhelming force to deploy, because Whitworth could carefully consider his approach and position his forces optimally, and coordinate the attack to ensure that German destroyers couldn't escape or reinforce each other effectively. The decision to use warspite, despite the navigational challenges of bringing a battleship into confined waters, proved decisive because her 15-inch guns could destroy German destroyers with single hits, while German return fire was essentially ineffective against her heavy armor, creating an asymmetric engagement where one side could inflict damage without suffering equivalent losses. The psychological impact on German crews who found themselves trapped and facing inevitable defeat must have been profound, with men knowing that their options were limited to fighting until their ships were destroyed or attempting escape that would likely fail, or surrendering to enemy forces that might not take prisoners in the heat of battle. The decision by several German captains to scuttle their ships rather than allow them to be captured or destroyed by enemy fire represented both practical acceptance of inevitable defeat and symbolic gesture maintaining naval honor by ensuring their ships wouldn't become British prizes even if they couldn't be saved. The salvage possibilities for the sunken destroyers were essentially non-existent given 1940s technology and the depth and conditions where the wrecks lay, with most vessels settling in water too deep for practical recovery operations and the structural damage from battle and scuttling, making them unsuitable for repair even if they could have been raised. The Germans made no serious attempts to recover their destroyers from Ofotfjord, accepting them as total losses and focusing instead on replacing the capabilities they represented through new construction that would take years to complete. And the British had no interest in salvaging German wrecks that would require enormous effort to raise and repair while providing relatively limited value compared to their own construction programs. The strategic consequences of losing 10 destroyers extended far beyond the immediate numerical reduction in German naval strength because these ships had been intended to serve as escorts for capital ships and screens for U-boat operations and commerce raiders, with their loss forcing reorganization of German naval operations and acceptance that certain missions could no longer be conducted safely. The planned surface raiding operations that required destroyer escorts had to be scaled back or cancelled, while U-boat operations lost valuable surface support that could have provided weather reporting and target identification and rescue services for submarines that were damaged or forced to surface. The morale impact on the Kriegsmarine from losing an entire destroyer flotilla in a single disastrous operation affected confidence in leadership and operational planning, with survivors and other naval personnel questioning whether the Norway campaign's gains justified the naval losses that had been suffered, particularly when those losses included irreplaceable modern ships and experienced crews that represented years of training and investment. The German Naval High Command attempted to portray Narvik as a tactical success despite the destroyer losses, emphasizing the successful landing of troops and capture of strategic objectives. But the narrative rang hollow among naval personnel who understood that losing 10 destroyers for one small port represented catastrophic trade-off in attritional warfare Germany couldn't sustain. The British celebration of their victory at Narvik was tempered by recognition that they had also suffered significant losses, including 2 destroyers sunk in the first battle, and Captain Warburton Lee killed along with over 150 crew members, reminding everyone that even victorious naval actions carried substantial costs. The posthumous Victoria Cross, awarded to Warburton Lee, recognized his courage in attacking, despite facing superior numbers, and his leadership in pressing home the attack even when the tactical situation deteriorated, providing inspiration for other naval officers who would face similar decisions about whether to engage outnumbered or withdraw to preserve forces. The lessons learned at Narvik about the dangers of operating destroyers in confined waters without adequate support or escape options influenced subsequent British and German naval operations throughout the war, with both sides becoming more cautious about committing valuable destroyers to situations where they might become trapped or forced to fight under unfavorable conditions. The British developed better coordination between capital ships and destroyers to ensure that smaller vessels had heavy gun support when operating in potentially dangerous situations, while the Germans became more conservative about risking destroyers in operations where losses would be difficult to replace, given their limited shipbuilding capacity. The technological lessons were relatively limited, because the battles demonstrated capabilities that were already understood about destroyer warfare and battleship firepower. But the operational lessons about logistics and planning and the importance of securing fuel supplies and escape routes before committing forces to operations in remote locations were reinforced dramatically by the disaster. The failure of the Jan Wellem to reach Narvik with her fuel cargo illustrated the vulnerability of logistical support to interception and the catastrophic consequences when critical supplies fail to arrive as planned, leading to more robust planning for future operations that included redundant supply lines and contingency plans. The propaganda value of Narvik for both sides was substantial, with Germany claiming success in capturing Norway and securing strategic resources, while glossing over destroyer losses, and Britain emphasizing the destruction of German naval forces while downplaying their own losses, and the fact that Germany ultimately retained control of Narvik and the surrounding region. The truth lay somewhere between these competing narratives, with both sides achieving some objectives while suffering significant losses. But from strategic naval perspective, the British clearly gained more by eliminating a substantial portion of Germany's destroyer force that couldn't be quickly replaced. The long-term historical assessments of Narvik's significance have varied, with some historians viewing it as relatively minor engagement in the broader context of World War II, while others see it as a pivotal moment that fundamentally altered naval balance in northern waters and influenced subsequent operations. The immediate impact was clearly significant for German naval planning and operations, forcing acceptance that their destroyer force was inadequate for the missions being demanded of it, and that conservation of remaining destroyers had to take priority over aggressive offensive operations that might result in additional losses the Kriegsmarine couldn't afford. The human stories from Narvik remain compelling decades later as survivors and their descendants remember the courage and sacrifice of men who fought and died in those cold Norwegian waters, with memorials in both Germany and Britain honoring the sailors who served on both sides and recognizing that military valor transcends national boundaries and deserves respect regardless of which flag men fought under. The diving expeditions that have explored the wrecks in recent decades have recovered artifacts and documented the battle damage and underwater conditions, providing physical evidence that complements historical records and helps modern audiences understand what happened during those 4 days in April 1940, when 10 German destroyers sailed into Ofotfjord and none sailed out again, trapped by geography and destroyed by British naval power, and remembered as cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate planning and logistics in naval warfare.